Greetings from Pintpot. Welcome to my latest edition of Climbing the Curve. Today I'm going to be taking a look at anti-aircraft weapons for infantry. Now you probably hadn't had to have been playing the game for very long before you become pretty familiar with the kill potential of planes, particularly against solitary infantry. ESFs and Liberators to an even greater extent pack an incredible punch. So what can infantry do to either dissuade them or destroy them? Well, one option to defend infantry is vehicle support for anti-aircraft. However, as I considered in my previous episode, this is rather expensive for new players. So what are the options open to infantry? Ignoring Empire specific rockets, there are only two options on the table: ground-to-air locker missiles and burster maxes. Now above I put out the number of shots to kill, plus the time to kill for each of these weapons against various aircraft. Also, for the purposes of comparison, I put down the times to kill for the various vehicle anti-aircraft weapons. Now one thing you might notice is that infantry anti-aircraft is less potent than vehicle anti-aircraft, and certainly with ground-to-air lock-on missiles, the times to kill are considerably longer. Now the balanced reasoning for what is on the face of it, the comparable weakness of infantry anti-aircraft capabilities, is the fact that infantry anti-aircraft capabilities are incredibly scalable. And what I mean by this is that bases with only a few infantry and say only one or two carrying anti-aircraft do not have a lot of kill potential. But bases with say 30 or 40 infantry and maybe 10 or 15 carrying anti-aircraft have enormous kill potential versus enemy aircraft. And I'll discuss the implications of this a little later in the video. But to start off with, the burster max. Now burster maxes use flat cannons. Flat cannons are relatively easy to use because they explode in close proximity to enemy aircraft. As a result, they do a little less damage than direct damage dealing anti-aircraft weapons such as the Walker heavy machine gun, but they are relatively forgiving in terms of their mechanics. Now when you start playing Planetside 2, you automatically have access to a burster max. However, as you can see from the numbers above, you become a lot more potent in terms of your anti-aircraft role if you can invest the additional 1,000 certs to buy the second arm. In fact, I would go as far to say as it's pretty much mandatory if you want to be an effective anti-aircraft deterrent. And the reason for this is because against planes, particularly ESFs, given their speed and mobility, you usually have a very limited window of opportunity to deal damage to them. Therefore, it is important to pack in as much damage within a short space of time as possible. Now using maxes rather than infantry for anti-aircraft duty has several advantages. Firstly, its damage output is greater than a heavy assaults with the ground-to-air lock-on missile. Secondly, its damage cannot be mitigated by flares. And thirdly, and potentially most importantly, it's much more robust than an infantryman. A max with a higher rank flak armor in its suit slots can take quite a lot of punishment. Also, given the fact it can be repaired very quickly by engineers, it means that it can stay out in the battle regardless of ESFs in particular attacking it. Therefore it provides a very durable form of anti-aircraft cover. Its relatively low time to kill against ESFs make it also a particular peril, particularly at shorter ranges. Also its kill potential can be further enhanced by adding extended magazines to the burster arms. This increases capacity by 50% from 28 to 42 per magazine. Now looking at the comparable times to kill, it doesn't seem to make a massive difference having extended magazines. However, in practice you're not going to be 100% accurate, particularly against fast moving targets like ESFs. Having extended magazines changes the necessary accuracy to destroy an ESF in one clip from 70% to 40%. In other words, using extended magazines makes it dramatically easier to destroy ESFs without having to reload. However, it does have limitations. The principal limitation comes from the suit it's on, the max suit, which is incredibly slow. Therefore maxes provide much better anti-aircraft cover at fixed locations rather than on the move. In other words, in bases when you're on the defence, and at infantry strongholds around sunderers when you're attacking. Also, as the damage is scalable, multiple burster maxes can pretty much lock down the airspace around certain defence points. However, at longer distances, say past 300 or 400 meters, burster maxes start to underperform relative to vehicle mounted anti-aircraft flat cannons, particularly the Skyguard. This is because they have a greater damage drop off and a slower muzzle velocity, making it harder for them to lead on further away targets. Therefore, Maxes are a potent form of anti-aircraft defence, but tend to be pigeonholed around defending certain areas. They simply lack the mobility to be utilised properly outside of these zones. Now, the ground-to-air lock-on missile, available to the heavy assault, is by far the cheapest form of anti-aircraft. It is therefore by far the most accessible to newer players. It also does reasonable damage. Against an ESF it takes off about 40% of its health, but the time to kills are pretty long, and that's down to the reload time of 5.2 seconds. In addition, flares break lock-ons and make the plane immune for the next 5 seconds. And if you're trying to get a lock-on, if you get line of sighted even for a moment, you lose the timer on the lock-on. However, should you achieve a lock-on and their flares are on cooldown, your chances of hitting are very high because it's extremely difficult for planes to avoid lock-on missiles. So in other words, they're effective weapons and reasonably powerful, but they do have noticeable limitations. And how does this affect their gameplay and potency against air? Well, the answer is, similar to Burster Maxes, they become incredibly scalable in large numbers. The reason why they have such a long time to kill is because of the 5.2 second reload time. However, say you had 3 heavy assaults and an ESF's flares are in cooldown, if they all get a lock on, then you can take down that ESF pretty much immediately. Therefore, once you start achieving a critical mass of heavy assaults or ground-to-air missiles, then it becomes incredibly dangerous for enemy aircraft to be in the region, subject to certain limitations. And those limitations are these. Firstly, there's a maximum distance you can achieve a lock-on, which is 450 meters against air targets. Therefore, planes which are flying high above the ground are pretty much immune from the threat. In addition, regardless of how many troops are trying to get a lock-on, if an aircraft has flares and uses them, they are entirely immune from the threat for a small period of time. This means that ESFs, if they wait for their flares to be off cooldown, can attack in an area with lots of heavy assaults or ground-to-air missiles and still be confident that they can escape without being severely injured. This does not apply against Burster Maxes, as there is no such defense against flak. However, if the ESFs remain in line of sight after their flares are off cooldown, then they can be severely punished very quickly. And the way this tends to affect gameplay is this. Good ESF pilots are aware of these limitations and can still attack large groups of infantry with confidence to be able to get away by using line of sight and their flares. However, they have a very small window of opportunity to achieve this. More inexperienced ESF pilots often make the mistake of hanging around once their flares are on cooldown, and as a result can be pretty much instantly destroyed by multiple lock-ons. And another implication is this. Though because of the limitations in terms of line of sight and flares, ground-to-air missiles cannot guarantee safety against air, they complement other air-to-air very well. Each missile will do about 40% damage to an ESF, so if they've already received damage from other sources such as flak, then you can put them down very easily. They can also decisively help your own planes in dogfights by forcing the other side's planes to use flares or providing some additional damage. So how do these missiles perform against liberators? Well, the same principle applies, apart from you have to scale up the numbers accordingly. Whilst an ESF can take 3 hits from lock-on missiles, a liberator can take 8. Therefore, rather than 2 or 3 heavy assaults being required to provide a mortal threat against them, you need more like 4 or 5. Therefore, if you only have 1 or 2 heavy assaults providing anti-air support against enemy liberators, it becomes incredibly ineffectual. The implication of this is that in low population areas, aircraft can become incredibly dominant because you cannot achieve the critical mass necessary to become a credible threat. However, in high population areas, where there's potentially 10 to 15 heavy assaults or ground-to-air missiles, it gets locked down almost entirely to enemy aircraft other than the most skilled pilots. So when it comes to using ground-to-air missiles, to best enhance your survivability, this is what I recommend you do. I have listed above the effective health of a heavy assault who's using the nanite mesh generator plus flak armor against explosive damage. As you can see, with higher levels of flak armor you can survive a great deal of punishment from planes. Therefore it is imperative that if you're fighting ESFs in particular, that you go out with flak armor. Now the problem is that if you get rocket podded and you put your shield on, the energy in that shield can be depleted. Therefore you have to wait a long time for it to recover, so you have sufficient survivability to use another rocket. However, there is a very useful workaround for this problem. If you go to an infantry equipment terminal and resupply your heavy assault, it will fully recharge both its shields and the energy for its nanite mesh generator. This means to be most effective, you want to situate your heavy assault near an infantry terminal. In this way you can go out, use your rocket, use your shield if necessary, rush in and recharge both your shield and your energy level to full, and do it again just a moment later. Now if you use the infantry terminal to re-equip your heavy assault before you finish reloading your rocket, after you use the infantry terminal it will do a long reload on your primary weapon. Therefore you're best waiting until the rocket has been reloaded before using the infantry terminal. Now using this technique you can increase your survivability against planes very considerably. However, be warned, against liberators, given the fact that damage is so high, and particularly against shredders that both do direct damage and explosive damage, even with high flak armor and the shield, your survivability is very short. Therefore if they're firing at you, get into cover immediately. In addition, against ESFs, if they use flares against you and they are pointing towards you with the intent to kill, then get into cover. You cannot survive the 5 seconds the flare gives them protection, plus the amount of time it takes you to lock on. One final note on ground-to-air locker missiles is the fact that they are extremely inefficient against enemy galaxies. It takes 16 shots to take down an enemy galaxy, which obviously in terms of time to kill is enormous. Therefore, enemy galaxies should be deprioritized versus ESFs and liberators when you're using ground-to-air locker missiles. You're better off leaving galaxies to your own side's flak, heavy machine guns and ESFs. So, in conclusion, ground-to-air locker missiles for heavy assaults are clearly the most accessible form of anti-aircraft for newer players. As both a credible deterrent and threat, they work extremely well in large numbers, but can become very impotent in small numbers. Burster maxes are less reliant on numbers to remain effective, but the investment required to put into them is considerable for new players. 1,000 certs to get the second arm, an additional 1,000 certs to get extended magazines on both arms. Therefore this is an option you should be looking at much later in the game. Now my next episode I'll be looking at basic gun mechanics and what sort of properties the gun should have to be optimal at various ranges. In the meantime, have a good one, happy hunting, and Pintpot out.